So next, let's implement post. Now back in Visual Studio, we can see a new type of controller that was created off screen, Diary Entries Controller. Not surprisingly, this is a controller for the diary entries themselves. We created this without showing you the actual code because it was just duplicative with what we've done in other instances. You can see the counting repository, the identity service, just like we did with the diary in the last video, and that we just implemented get using the repository for both a collection and an individual object. We're using the create response to show when they request a diary entry that doesn't exist, and then going ahead and returning the correct type of diary entry. We're also using a diary entry model, just like we did with the diary and diary model, and we're using another create method in the model factory in order to create these new diary entries. If we look and see what this looks like in the browser, we can see that we're returning a set of diary entries for a particular diary, and we're creating an URL for each of those diary entries, just like we did with the diary. We're also creating an URL for embedded data. In the case of the entry, it contains the measure and the related food, so all we are returning to the client is the description of the food and measure, as well as an URL directly to that individual measure, as well as the quantity that was consumed. We follow these links, we can see that we can get back to the exact measure and food that was consumed. Because we implemented the get, that we can see individual entries themselves, as well as a collection of entries within a particular diary. The next step is to allow us to actually add new entries, which is what we'll do with the post method. So let's go back to our controller, and let's create a new public method, and I'm just going to return an object for now, and we'll get back and refactor that in a minute. And in order to do a post, we simply mark it as post. Like our other methods in this class, we need the diary ID from the path to be included in our post here, so that we know which diary to add it to. Now we're only going to support posting to the collection entries to insert a new object into those entries. We're not going to allow users to post directly to an individual ID because it makes no sense. So we could go ahead and support inserting this object into our repository, but we need that object. So here in the parameter list, we're going to tell it that we want a diary entry model, and I'll just call this the model. And this is the data that is being passed from the user to us. And so we want to go ahead and implement what this looks like. Let's open up Fiddler a second so we can see what this is going to look like for the actual user. So in order to post, let's go back to our browser and let's just borrow this URI that is the URI to the entries for this particular diary. And let's say we want to add a new entry here. We're going to post to that URI. So this is simply the diaries endpoint and then the date of that diary and then the entries. We're going to post directly to that. This URI will end up calling the code in this post method. But we need to be able to pass in what is the data for the diary entry. How do we do that? We actually do that in the body. So let's change this to post, and let's go ahead and just format a JSON body. When we look back here, we can see that a diary entry is made up of a URL for its own element. We don't have to actually supply that in post because that's something that's going to be computed on the back end for them. We have a description and a measure, which are really read-only elements. These are inferred by the measure URL. We need a measure URL to point at what is the actual food being eaten, not only the food, but all the measure for that food, and then the quantity that they ate. So let's start with quantity, and over in Fiddler, just say quantity equals 5. And the only other element we really need here is measure URL, because we need to be able to identify the kind of food and the measure for that food. So let's come over here and let's go over to our foods. And as we're looking through here, let's decide that they're going to eat some acorn flour, with lots of fat in it, evidently. This is 1 ounce of acorn flour. So I'm just going to copy the URL for the measure of the acorn flour and use it here as our measure URL. So I've got a JSON object here that represents the diary entry. And this JSON object is in the body of the request. So we need to be able to tell it what kind of data we're sending it. And so we're going to need to add headers. In here it's going to be content type, and I'll just say application JSON because I know it's JSON. And in fact, Fiddler will add a header for the size. If I try to execute this right now, it'll actually come back as a 405 because a post isn't allowed yet. We haven't really compiled that new post code. So the result of this request is that the requested resource does not support post. But you notice that when we executed it, it gave us the content length for us. It's one of the things that Fiddler will do for you is compute that content length so that this request is actually accurate. Now that we know where the data is and what this looks like, let's go back to the code and understand how we're going to actually be passed in this post. The trick is to say from body. It's an attribute you can put directly on the parameter, and this is going to tell Web API that we want to pass into the post an object model. So we want it to infer what the JSON is into an instance of the diary entry model from the body of that post. So at this point we have, or we should be getting, an actual valid model. Let's go ahead and say return null for just a moment, and let's set a breakpoint here. Then back in Fiddler, let's try to execute this again, and it should stop us in our code. But at this point, we can actually see what we're getting in the model. The model isn't null, and if we go ahead and look at the elements, it has mapped into it based on what it could infer from the JSON object. It put the quantity in because we named that correctly, and it brought in the measure URL. It doesn't know about the food description or the measure description or the URL for this object because they weren't supplied, and that's fine with us. The information of the quantity and measure URL is enough for us to figure out what this object is. So let's stop this and really implement this now that we understand how these parameters are going to be mapped for us. We now at this point have an instance of the model, but we have to figure out how to actually inject that into the repository. So let's start by throwing out a try catch. And in the catch, let's just return create response bad request. Now there's a couple of different ways we can create this response. The request also allows us to create error response, and this is often helpful but may leak some information about your backend to users. So use it where you think it makes sense. But in this case, we're going to create an error response. And the second parameter when it's a create error response is one of a couple of things. It can be an exception, it can be an HTTP error, which you can get sometimes. It could also just be a string, but in our case, let's go ahead and pass in that exception. So if something bad happens, we can actually take this exception and show it to the user. This way, if there's problems with the data that's being passed in, this exception might include the right information. Depending on your security scenario, leaking what is in that exception information to the end user may or may not be a good idea. You may decide you just want to send back bad request without really giving them an idea of what is wrong. So now we need to be able to get the actual entity that represents data that's in the model. And so we can use the model factory again, and we're going to create a new type of method in the model factory called parse. This is going to be the opposite of create. We're going to pass in the model and expect that it's going to return to us a diary entry entity that we can insert into the database. So I'm going to go ahead and use refactoring just to create the stub, and let's go over to it. Try to infer some things, so let's fix this by saying public and diary entry. And in here, let's also do a quick try catch, just to say that if we get this far, let's go ahead and return a null. If we couldn't parse it for one reason or another, we can test on the other side of this that a null happened. Because sometimes we may want to give them more information about why it failed, and not being able to parse is one of those pieces of information. You could imagine that maybe thinking that there's one too many levels of try catch here would be useful, but it's actually not. So let's go ahead and create a new diary entry object, and let's determine how we can go ahead and parse this information. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say if the model's quantity does not equal the default of double is the data type of quantity, then that means the quantity has actually been set. If it has actually been set, then I'll go ahead and also set it on the entry. Now we could just set it even if it was the default, but this way we know it was actually set. The second piece is how do you determine what that URL is pointing to? This is a case where you're actually going to have to parse the URL and determine some information about it. In my case, I'm just going to create a new URI, and I'm going to pass it in the model.measure URL. I'm doing this so that I can then get the parts of the URI. I'm doing this so that I can get a string version of the ID of the measure. And I can look at segments and just go ahead and get the last segment, and then I'm going to say int.parse. Now you may wonder why I don't do try parse here, and I'm avoiding try parse here because I want it to fail if the last segment, if the measure URI isn't an integer. We'll go ahead and return null because we couldn't figure out what the actual measure ID was. And now we need to go ahead and get the objects that represent the food and measure based on this new measure ID. Problem is that if we call the repository, it's gone. The reason it's gone is that it's not here in the model factory. So we're going to want to refactor this to include the repository as needed. So I'll go ahead and add counting k's repository. Go ahead and bring that in. And then like we've done before, I'll go ahead and just refactor it to create an instance of it. Then I can just use the repository to get measure using that measure ID. And then I can set it. Entry.measure equals measure, and entry.food item equals measure.food, which is attached to it. And then we can just return that entry. Because we've made this change to the model factory, if we build it quickly, we'll notice that it doesn't like it. This is no longer the way to build it, so we can now simply add in the repository as the second parameter. We're doing this in the base API controller so that we only have that one place that we're creating this and using it. So let's go back to our diaries controller where we had the post. And let's say that if the entity equals null, we can just do request.create error response, bad request, could not read diary entry in body. So we couldn't parse it, so we're going to give them some sort of error that lets them know that the error is in the body of the message that was sent. You can be more clever about how you let them know that. Now we'll simply go ahead and get a diary. We'll get that from the repository. We'll get the diary by first passing in the identity service current user and then our diary ID, just like we've gotten the diary before. And if the diary equals null, then we can then say request.create response status code not found. So we're trying to add a entry to a diary that doesn't exist. And lastly, we just need to say diary.entries.add entity, the repository.save all. So now that we've supposedly saved it, again, the exception is going to catch it if the save doesn't work and the adding of the entity to the entries doesn't work. So here we can successfully just say return request.create response HTTP status code OK, except that in the case of post, you shouldn't return OK. You should return created. Post has a relationship with the status code to say we actually created an entity here, therefore I'm going to return a 201, which is the status code for created instead. But we should also return the new entity. The reason for this is the database, as it builds this and it adds it, it's going to do things like specify the new ID correctly, so that the data we're sending back is the fully formed version of that diary entry. So we'll go to the model factory and create our model from our entity. Let's see if I did everything correctly. And let's try to actually post it again. Again, same data. Execute 201. And in the body of the result is going to be the JSON that represents the actual data. Here's the food description, acorn flour, measure description is 1 ounce. There's the URI for the entire measure, as well as the quantity we had specified, and the URL of the new object, which is 19. This way they can take the new object that was passed back and actually just use it as a fully formed object instead of assuming this missing data or just having it null. They're getting the actual object that they then can use to go ahead and post updates or delete it later if they need to. But this would mean that we could go ahead and add a new element into that collection that was also the same nutritional information. What if they ate more acorn flour, or maybe the user of your API is confused? Because what we want to see in a daily diary, let's say one of our business rules is that a diary only contains the same food once. So that if you eat 2 pats of butter at breakfast, 1 pat at lunch, and 8 pats at dinner, that you're going to have a total of 12 in that diary instead of 3 separate entries for butter. This may or may not be the right solution for building a website, but let's say that's our business rule. Right here in our code is where we're going to want to test that. So let's say we've got the diary, and before we go ahead and save the new entry, let's make sure it's not duplicate. And we can simply do that by saying if diary.entries any, and we use a little link here to say if the measure.id equals the entity.measure.id. So if the measure ID of any of the entries that already exist equal the measure ID of the entity we're about to insert, let's go ahead and throw an error. And then I'll just give them a little string that says duplicate measure not allowed. Let's go ahead and re-execute our same insert to see whether we are going to get this error. Yep, 400, and then the JSON message that is returned has that message in it so that they could show it to the user or determine from debugging that something is in fact wrong. One of the problems that may crop up is adding this diary entry in may fail without throwing an exception. So we really should be checking whether the save all, because it returns a bool, has succeeded before we return our created status code. Let's go ahead and put an else in there and just return a bad request. In this case, I'll say could not save to the database, so that they know that something awful has happened. And right now, this post is working just as we expected it to, but one thing that I don't like is that early on we had decided to return an object, which of course, now that we've built it, we know we want this to be a response message, because in every case we're returning a response message. Maybe only a status ID, maybe a status ID with some state, or in the case of returning the created, returning the status ID plus our new model. Make sense?